Often we hear about the work of UNESCO, and I'm very pleased indeed to introduce to you Mr. Ordonez, the Regional Director of UNESCO. Mr. Ordonez, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
You're really multicultural, aren't you? Born here, working there, coming somewhere else. Where were you last before you came to Thailand?
Just before coming to Thailand, I was 5 years in the UNESCO headquarters in Paris.
That must have been very interesting.
Indeed it was. It was the headquarters of our organization. It was a good introduction to the lofty ideals and mandate of UNESCO.
What was your responsibility there?
When I was in Paris, I was responsible for the program that coordinated all of our work in basic education. That included primary education, adult literacy, education for refugees, education for those with special needs, anything that wasn't university or technical.
Had you worked in the education area before?
Yes, off and on. Just prior to joining UNESCO in Paris, I was the Deputy Minister of Education in the Philippines. And before that, of course, I was teaching in UCLA in California in the same field.
So you made a big change by moving from the Philippines to Paris?
Yes, I did.
Moving from Parliament to UNESCO?
That's right. And then, of course, from Paris to Bangkok.
Very many changes. What are some of the academic degrees that you hold? Because I know that apart from working with UNESCO and being a politician, you are an academic.
I'm fundamentally that. In fact, my introduction to government service was an accident of history. When President Aquino took over the Philippine government, I was at the time doing some work in the Philippines, visiting from California, and I was asked to join government. So my degrees span a number of fields, including, of course, education, science, English. I have a PhD in Oriental philosophy, which is my first doctorate.
That must be very useful now, isn't it?
Well, if it teaches you to think correctly, it's useful.
If it teaches you to think as an Oriental, it would be very useful.
Absolutely, absolutely.
And it must help you in that regard.
Indeed it does.
What type of developments do you see yourself being involved with in Thailand?
Well, if the 20th century is anything, it's the century of 21st century. It's a century of Asia. It's also a century where I think national boundaries are going to be less important than regional alliances. And so I'm very glad to be in this place at this time, because I feel there is so much promise in this continent. UNESCO has been mandated within the UN family to be basically the ethical voice of the organization, to recognize that if we are to build the defenses of peace throughout the world, it can only be in the minds of men. And therefore, our job in the regional office in UNESCO for Asia is to see to it that the education, science, and cultural parts of man's undertaking continue through national boundaries and to be used as vehicles for international understanding, peace, and development.
Have you been outside of Bangkok very much yet?
This trip I've been so busy learning the office and getting to know my work that I haven't. But on previous trips to Thailand, I have been outside.
Because there must be a wonderful challenge here.
Thailand is a very interesting example of how much progress has been made in the fields of education, which I know the best, but also how certain problems continue to persist. In Thailand, we have one of the highest rates of literacy and primary education in Asia. But at the same time, you hear a lot about the need to continue to improve the quality and relevance of the educational system. I've just had a very interesting conversation with the Minister of Education of Thailand. His Excellency told me that he's looking very seriously at the quality and relevance of the curriculum in this country at this time.
To change it?
To improve it. A number of things. Connecting it, for example, with the changing demands of the workforce and useful to the vast majority of Thai people.
There's going to be a great increase in the teaching of English in provincial schools, I believe.
Indeed. And, of course, the key there is to prepare the teachers to do that.
Well, yes, because so many Thai people are learning to speak English from Thai-speaking people.
That's right.
And it's due to that reason that this channel put this program to
I
air,
see.
it's
I
not
see.
only to be informative and entertaining, but it's so that students can hear English spoken by a naturally English-speaking person.
I see.
Because there is a much greater interest now, isn't there?
Well, the world is shrinking, and English is more and more becoming the international language, and to the extent that this is a useful tool, not just for the leaders of the country, but for the entire country. To that extent, the country can move much more quickly forward.
Are there other particular areas where change or development will take place within the educational plan?
In Thailand? I think there's some emphasis now on science and technology as well, because as industry changes and evolves, as the skill requirements become of a higher level, so also the the labor force must acquire and adapt so that industry can take on more sophisticated tasks.
Dr. Ordonez, when you were in the Philippines as a member of the Parliament, were you surprised at some of the responsibilities that you had compared with your lifestyle in America?
Well, when I came to the Philippines, it was really a brand new government. At that time, in fact, we didn't even have a parliament. I was really with the technical aspect of things, the equivalent, I think, of a permanent secretary in this country. I was overwhelmed by the size of the ministry, and since I was a professor of comparative education, I was overwhelmed at that time by the recognition that the Philippines had one of the most centralized educational systems in the world. I had 330,000 public school teachers to be responsible for, which is not...
That's enormous.
Yes, it was not exactly the same as a graduate class in UCLA. But the challenge was certainly fascinating, and I spent 5 good years of my career doing what I could to improve the educational system in that country and to bring it into the 21st century.
Now, as Regional Director of UNESCO, you will be working outside Thailand as well as here, won't you?
Very much so. We cover 42 countries, from Iran and Turkey all the way to the small Pacific Islands.
All from Bangkok?
All from Bangkok. But we have a number of sub-regional offices that have just been created in the past 5 years. So there are 7 or 8 others. But this continues to be the principal regional office for the entire Asia-Pacific region. It's 62% of the world.
It's enormous.
It is enormous. And it's very diverse, too.
And it means you have a great responsibility.
Indeed, I do, yes. But I have a good staff with me, and we hope that together with the support we get from our headquarters, we can meet at least most of the needs that are brought to us.
Dr. Ordonez, I'm very interested that Thailand plays such a dominant role in such a large area. We're always talking about the development of Thailand and how Thailand is becoming the hub. But when somebody like you comes to the program and really qualifies that statement, it's very, very exciting for the country. Thank you so much for being part of the program.
It's a pleasure to be here.